In the year 1587, a group of 117 English men, women, and children landed on Roanoke Island, on the coast of what would one day be North Carolina. They carried with them the hope of a nation, a bold attempt to carve out the first permanent English settlement in the New World. Their governor, John White, sailed back to England for supplies, leaving behind his daughter, Eleanor, and his newborn granddaughter, Virginia Dare, the first English child born in the Americas. He promised a swift return, but war with Spain trapped him in Europe for 3 long, agonizing years. When he finally returned in 1590, the settlement was deserted. There were no signs of a struggle, no bodies, no graves. Only 2 clues remained: the word CROATOAN carved into a palisade post, and the letters CRO carved into a nearby tree. The colonists, including White's family, had vanished as if into thin air, becoming America's most foundational and enduring mystery. For over 4 centuries, their fate was lost to time, a ghost story whispered on the winds of the Outer Banks, the truth buried under layers of speculation, myth, and the shifting sands. Theories ranged from a violent massacre to peaceful assimilation with local tribes, but no evidence ever provided a definitive answer. The lost colony remained lost. But 435 years later, a geologist studying coastal erosion on Hatteras Island, the historical land of the CROATOAN people, would inadvertently uncover an anomaly, a shadow in the earth that would reopen the coldest of cases. He was not looking for history, but history, it seemed, was waiting to be found. A signal from the past, faint and deep, was about to pull a determined historian into a dark conspiracy of power, betrayal, and a truth far more shocking than anyone had ever dared to imagine. The story of the lost colony was not over. A new, final chapter was about to be written. The air on Hatteras Island was thick with salt and the ghosts of memory, a place where the present tense felt fragile. Dr. Kenji Tanaka was a man of science, of seismic waves and sediment layers, not of ghosts. His work was for the future, predicting and mitigating the slow, relentless consumption of the coastline by the Atlantic. He piloted his ground-penetrating radar array across a patch of scrubland, a low-lying marshy area well inland from the tourist-trodden beaches. The GPR unit hummed its monotonous song, painting a picture of the world beneath his feet in lines of green, amber, and red on his laptop screen. He was looking for ancient river channels, peat deposits, the geological grammar of the island. For days, the data had been predictable, a story of sand and clay written over millennia. But then, something appeared on his screen that made him stop. It was an unnatural shape, a stark geometric pattern buried nearly 12 feet down. A massive rectangle, too perfect, too ordered to be a work of nature. It was dense, suggesting a buried structure, with regularly spaced points of high density along its perimeter, like support posts. His brow furrowed. He checked his GPS coordinates. He was miles south of the known archaeological sites, far from the Manteo-era villages or any recorded colonial-era structures. This was supposed to be empty land. He ran the scan again, and then again from a different angle. The image was resolute, unwavering. A hidden enclosure, nearly an acre in size, sleeping beneath the marsh. He thought of old shipwrecks, their timbers slowly consumed by the acidic soil. But this was too large, too complex. It felt more like a fortification, a hidden fort. Who would build a fort here, and why bury it or allow it to be so completely swallowed by the earth? A prickle of unease, an unfamiliar sensation for a man of hard data, ran down his spine. This was not his field, but he knew enough to understand that some discoveries belonged to others. He carefully saved the data, marking the precise coordinates with a small, discreet flag that was nearly invisible against the swaying sea oats. That evening, he sent an email with the GPR scans attached to the North Carolina Office of State Archaeology. The subject line was simple: unidentified subsurface anomaly, Hatteras Island. He could not know that his routine, almost reluctant email was a spark thrown into a powder keg of history, an electronic signal that would travel across the country and land on the screen of the one person who had spent her entire life waiting for it. The message from the deep had found its interpreter. Dr. Eris Thorne lived and breathed in the quiet, dusty spaces between the pages of history. Her office at the university was a fortress of knowledge, its walls lined not with degrees or accolades, but with rare maps of the Elizabethan world and shelves groaning under the weight of colonial records, first-hand accounts, and every scholarly work ever published on the Roanoke voyages. To her colleagues, she was a brilliant, if narrowly focused, historian. To her students, she was a passionate storyteller who made the 16th century feel immediate and vital. But to herself, Eris was a detective. The disappearance of the Roanoke colony was her case, the one that had captivated her since she was a child reading a simplified, haunting account of Virginia Dare. For 20 years, she had meticulously deconstructed the myth. She had challenged the prevailing theories, finding them too neat, too simple to explain the complete and total silence that followed 1590. The assimilation theory felt like a comforting fable, the massacre theory a convenient horror story. Neither accounted for the strangeness of the clues, the deliberate carving of CROATOAN, the lack of the distress signal, the Maltese cross, that John White had explicitly instructed them to leave. It felt less like an ending, and more like a message left unfinished. She'd always trusted her intuition, a sense that the key to the mystery was not in what was found, but in what was so conspicuously absent: a body, a weapon, a definitive trace. She believed the truth was not lost, but actively concealed. When the email arrived, forwarded from the North Carolina state archaeologist with a note that read, "Eris, you need to see this," her initial reaction was the weary skepticism of an expert who had seen countless false alarms. Dowsing rods, psychic visions, oddly shaped rocks, she had been presented with them all. But as she opened the file containing Dr. Tanaka's GPR scans, the skepticism evaporated, replaced by a surge of adrenaline that was cold and sharp. She saw it instantly: the clean, rectangular outline, the post-hole-like anomalies. It wasn't the location of the famous lost colony on the north end of Roanoke Island. It was on Hatteras, the land of CROATOAN, just as the carving suggested. But this was not the site of a known CROATOAN village. It was hidden, defensive, and its construction, even as a digital ghost, felt wrong. It was a hybrid, a cultural chimera that didn't fit neatly into either English or Native American architectural patterns. What was it? A last stand? A prison? A sanctuary? The questions came in a flood, washing away decades of frustration. This was it, the anomaly, the single, out-of-place clue that could unravel everything. Within an hour, she had booked a flight to North Carolina. As the plane descended towards the coast, she looked down at the thin, fragile ribbon of the Outer Banks, a landscape that had kept its secret for more than 4 centuries. She felt a profound sense of purpose, but also a deep, chilling premonition. She wasn't just chasing a historical curiosity. She was chasing the dead, and she had a terrible feeling she was about to find them. The dig site was a rawl wound in the earth, carved out of the marshy soil under a relentless Carolina sun. The air was a humid soup of brine, mud, and the buzzing of insects. Eris Thorne stood at the edge of the excavation pit, her boots sinking slightly into the damp sand. The atmosphere among the small, hand-picked team of archaeologists and students was one of hushed, electric anticipation. 4 weeks, they had painstakingly removed the layers of earth, peeling back time with trowels and brushes. Now, the top of the structure that Dr. Tanaka's radar had seen was exposed to the light for the first time in centuries. It was the corner of a palisade wall, but unlike any Eris had ever studied. The sharpened logs were set deep, in the English style, meant for defense. But they were interspersed with woven panels of river cane and bound with a technique she recognized as specific to the Algonquian-speaking peoples of the region. It was a fortress born of 2 worlds, a testament to collaboration, or a desperate appropriation of local knowledge. It was built not on high, defensible ground, but hunkered down in a low-lying area shielded from the sound and the sea by dunes and thickets of live oak. It was designed not just to keep people out, but to remain hidden. They weren't just defending themselves, Eris murmured, her voice barely audible over the wind. They were hiding. As the team expanded the pit, the first artifacts began to emerge. They were mundane, yet world-shattering. A shard of Bellarmine pottery, a common stoneware from the Rhineland, unmistakably English in origin. But just inches away, nestled in the same stratigraphic layer, they found a piece of a clay pot of local CROATOAN design. A forensic ceramicist on the team, a young graduate student named Ben, pointed out the critical detail. "The temper is wrong," he said, holding the local shard. "The CROATOAN used crushed shell to strengthen their pottery. This is sand-tempered, and the clay itself isn't from this island. It's more like the alluvial clay you find on the mainland." Eris felt a cold knot tighten in her stomach. They were trying to replicate their own pottery techniques, using unfamiliar local materials. This wasn't evidence of peaceful trade and coexistence. This was a sign of isolation, of a group cut off from normal supply lines, trying desperately to recreate the tools of their former lives. They were making do. They were surviving. Day after day, more objects surfaced, each one adding a brushstroke to a darkening portrait of the colony's final days. A rusted iron nail, a lead musket ball, a small, simple brass button from a woman's dress. Each item was a whisper from a ghost, a tangible link to the people who had been reduced to a single cryptic word. The team worked with a reverent intensity, aware that they were treading on sacred ground. They were not just excavating a site, they were exhuming a tragedy, piece by agonizing piece. The question of what happened was slowly being answered, but the more they found, the more a larger, more terrible question began to loom. Why? The discovery that shifted the entire investigation from an archaeological puzzle to a terrifying human drama came on the 27th day of the dig. A team member working near the center of the buried enclosure felt his trowel strike something hard and unyielding. Not the soft thud of wood or the grating scrape of stone, but a dull, metallic clank. A solemn silence fell over the pit as they carefully brushed away the dark, peaty soil. What they revealed was a small, rectangular box about 2 feet long and a foot wide. It was made of lead, its surface pitted and gray with age, but remarkably intact. It was not a coffin, too small for even a child. It was a chest, a coffer, sealed with a care that spoke of the immense value of its contents. A lead casket. Lead was a precious commodity, difficult to transport, its use reserved for roofing on grand houses or, more grimly, for sealing the coffins of the wealthy to preserve their remains. Why would a starving, struggling colony use such a valuable resource to bury a small, plain box in the middle of their secret hideout? Eris's heart hammered against her ribs. This was the anomaly, a deliberate act of preservation. This wasn't something lost, it was something left. It was a message. Under the watchful eye of a state archaeologist and a conservation specialist, the casket was carefully raised from its earthy tomb. It was heavier than it looked, dense with the weight of its secrets. Back in the makeshift field lab, a converted trailer humming with air conditioning, they worked to open it. There was no lock. The lid had been soldered shut. With painstaking precision, a specialist cut through the ancient seal. As the lid was lifted, the air inside, trapped for over 400 years, escaped with a faint, musty sigh. There was no glint of gold, no silver, no jewels. The treasure inside was of a different, more profound kind. On a bed of dried, crumbling fabric lay a collection of small, heartbreakingly personal items. A child's shoe, made of leather worn soft with use, its tiny laces still tied. A single, small pearl, likely from a local oyster, pierced to be worn on a string. A wooden bird, carved with a crude but loving hand. And beneath them, wrapped in oilcloth, was a tightly bound stack of vellum sheets. Eris, her hands trembling inside her nitrile gloves, lifted the packet. The vellum was fragile, the iron gall ink faded to a ghostly brown, but the handwriting was clear, an elegant, if hurried, Elizabethan script. It was not a ship's log or an official report. It was a list, a register. At the top of the first page, one name, Virginia Dare, and beside it, a date and a single, chilling phrase, taken by the fever of the New World. Eris read the next name and the next. Each was followed by a date and a cause of death. Agnes Wood, starvation. John Sampson, the bloody flux. Thomas Smart, despair. And then, a name she recognized from the official colonist manifest, followed by 2 words that made the air in the trailer turn to ice. George Howe, betrayal. Betrayal. Not disease, not a native arrow, not an accident. Betrayal. The word hung in the sterile air of the lab, a poison dart thrown across the centuries. The accepted narrative of the lost colony, The story of a people absorbed by a friendly tribe or wiped out by a hostile one, shattered in that instant. This was not a story of assimilation or conquest. It was something else, something darker, something that had been deliberately and meticulously hidden from the world. The vellum pages were a sacred text, a survivor's testimony that demanded to be heard. Eris Thorne flew with them back to a specialized conservation lab in Washington, D.C., the lead-lined box traveling like a diplomatic pouch. In the sterile quiet of the imaging lab, scientists used multispectral imaging, bathing the fragile documents in light from different wavelengths, from ultraviolet to infrared. The process coaxed the faded iron gall ink from its vellum prison, making the nearly invisible writing leap onto the monitor in sharp, heartbreaking relief. The list of the dead was only the beginning. The subsequent pages contained a full narrative account, and the hand, Eris confirmed by comparing it to known samples from England, belonged to Eleanor Dare, John White's daughter, Virginia's mother. Her words, elegant even, in their desperation, painted a picture far more complex and terrifying than any historian had ever proposed. The colonists had indeed gone to CROATOAN, seeking sanctuary with Mantio's people as planned. They were welcomed, albeit cautiously. For a time, there was a fragile peace, a blending of two worlds born of mutual need. But their supplies dwindled faster than they could be replenished. English bodies, unaccustomed to the pathogens of the New World, began to fail. The first winter was brutal, a slow attrition of disease and hunger that filled the first pages of Eleanor's sad accounting. But the true terror did not come from the wilderness or from any native hostility. It came from the sea. In the spring of 1588, nearly a year after White's departure, a ship appeared on the horizon. It was an English ship, but it was not John White's relief fleet. It was a privateer, a vessel named the Sea Serpent, flying a flag they did not recognize. Its captain came ashore not with promises of aid, but with demands. Eleanor's account described him as a ruthless man with a clipped, cold accent, who claimed to be acting under a charter from a nobleman of merit who believed Raleigh's patent on Virginia was forfeit. They were, in effect, corporate raiders. They demanded the colonists swear fealty to this new patron, hand over any maps they had made, and reveal the locations of any valuable resources they had found. When the colonists refused, citing their loyalty to Raleigh and the Queen, the privateer's posture turned from predatory to hostile. They were not there to rescue them. They were there to erase Raleigh's foothold in the Americas, to ensure his venture was a catastrophic failure. They established a cruel, informal blockade, their longboats patrolling the sounds, preventing the colonists from fishing in the rich waters or trading with mainland tribes for corn. They raided their stores, creating a state of manufactured famine. The betrayal that killed George Howe, the account revealed, was an ambush. He had been killed not by natives, but by Englishmen, his death then blamed on a local tribe to sow discord and shatter the fragile alliance the colonists had with the CROATOAN. The misleading narrative had been a deliberate tactic of war. The Roanoke venture was not just failing, it was being murdered. Eris felt a cold fury as she read Eleanor Dare's words. The ghosts of Roanoke were no longer silent, they were screaming. The name of the privateer vessel, the Sea Serpent, was the key. Back in her own archives, and through frantic calls to colleagues in the United Kingdom, she began a deep dive into the shipping records and court documents of the Elizabethan era, a world of coded letters, political maneuvering, and brutal ambition. The official records were a dead end. The Sea Serpent was listed as having sailed for the Caribbean on a trading mission, its logs tidy, and its timeline accounted for, at least on paper. It was too clean. It felt like a cover story. Eris's intuition told her to look not at the ship, but at its owner. The charter would have been granted by a member of the Queen's court, someone with the power and motive to challenge a figure as prominent as Sir Walter Raleigh. She cross-referenced Raleigh's known rivals, the powerful men who competed with him for the Queen's favor and for the immense wealth the New World promised. And then she found him, Lord Ralph Cavendish, a fictional name to stand in for a real archetype of the era, a man of immense wealth and influence, whose family had long seen Raleigh as an upstart, a brash favorite whose ambitions threatened their own. Cavendish's name appeared on the charter for the Sea Serpent. But more damningly, Eris found a series of letters in a private collection, letters between Cavendish and his ship's captain, a man named Cutler. The letters were cloaked in euphemisms, speaking of protecting our investment and ensuring our competitors find the market inhospitable. But one phrase, in a letter dated spring 1588, stood out as if written in blood. You must ensure Raleigh's venture withers on the vine. No half measures. Let the wilderness claim it. A failure of his will be a victory for us. Leave nothing for White to find. There it was, a death sentence, signed and sealed in a London manor house, to be carried out 3,000 miles away on a group of unsuspecting families. The hidden in plain sight culprit was not a savage warrior or the merciless forces of nature. It was an English nobleman in a silk doublet, motivated by greed and political power. The entire Roanoke mystery, the centuries of speculation, had been a lie, a cover story for what amounted to a political assassination on a colonial scale. Eris sat back, the weight of the discovery pressing down on her. The English crown must have known, or at least suspected. To admit that an English colony had been destroyed by another Englishman would have been a catastrophic scandal. It would have shattered the public's faith in the entire colonial project, an enterprise already fraught with risk and expense. The silence that followed John White's return was not born of ignorance. It was a deliberate, calculated act of state-sponsored forgetting. The 117 colonists were not just lost. They were erased, their true fate sacrificed to protect the reputation of a powerful man and the ambitions of an empire. Eleanor Dare's final pages were not a journal. They were a testament, a final, desperate attempt to make the truth known. Her script grew less steady, the sentences shorter, more frantic, as she chronicled the colony's death spiral. After the murder of George Howe and the severing of their alliance with the mainland tribes, the colonists, with the help of Mantio's people, retreated to the secret, hidden enclosure. It was their last redoubt. The palisade, a hybrid of two cultures, was a symbol of their final, desperate state. English people relying on native knowledge to hide from their own countrymen. The privateers are wolves, Eleanor wrote. They circle us from the water. We cannot fish. We cannot hunt. They have offered bounty to any tribe that brings them an English head, turning the fearful into our enemies. They have made this paradise a prison. She documented the insidious spread of disease, likely smallpox or influenza, brought by the sea serpent and allowed to fester among the malnourished colonists. It was a nascent form of biological warfare, a cruel, passive-aggressive extermination. The healthy grew sick, the sick grew weak, and the weak died. Her own daughter, Virginia, the symbol of a new beginning, was one of the first to perish in the epidemic. The entry detailing her death was a single, tear-blotted sentence of pure anguish. The carving of CROATOAN on the fort at the north end of the island was their last act of defiance and a multi-layered message. To John White, it was the location of their final sanctuary. But to any other English ship, like the privateers, it was a declaration that they had thrown their lot in with the native people, an act of going native that would have been seen as a profound betrayal of their Englishness. It was a warning that they were no longer Raleigh's colonists, but the people of CROATOAN. The missing Maltese cross was the most chilling message of all. The cross was to be carved if they were in distress. They omitted it because their situation was beyond distress. It was a state of war, instigated by their own kind. To leave the cross would have been to ask for help from any English ship that might arrive, a risk they could not take when the English had become their primary enemy. In her final entry, Eleanor described the decision to bury the casket. The remaining survivors were a handful of starving, sick people. She knew they would not last another winter. "Let this box be our stone," she wrote. "Let it be our voice when we are dust. Sir Walter was our patron, but it was Lord Cavendish who was our devil. We came here seeking a new life, but found only a new kind of English cruelty. Do not let them say we were lost to the wilderness. We were stolen. We were murdered by the greed of a man who never set foot on these shores. Remember us." Eris read the final words through a blur of tears. It was a confession, not of guilt but of truth. It was a complete, damning indictment that had waited 4 centuries to be heard. Eleanor Dare had not just recorded history, she had armed the future with it. The culmination of Eris Thorne's life's work was not to be a quiet academic paper. The story of the Roanoke colonists demanded a reckoning. She chose the stage of the largest annual conference on American colonial history, a gathering of the world's most respected and traditional historians. The lecture hall was packed, the air buzzing with scholarly chatter. Many in the audience knew Eris's reputation as a Roanoke obsessive, and the title of her presentation, The Roanoke Colony, a reassessment of the evidence, had generated a skeptical curiosity. They were expecting a new interpretation of old data, not a historical bombshell. Eris stood at the podium, the faces of the academic establishment looking up at her. In the front row sat Dr. Alastair Finch, a towering figure in Elizabethan studies, a man who had written the definitive biography of Lord Ralph Cavendish, portraying him as a stern but principled pillar of the Tudor court. Finch's entire career was built on the established narrative Eris was about to detonate. Her voice was steady as she began, not with her own theories, but with the mystery itself, the story of John White's tragic return. She then transitioned to the present day, displaying Dr. Tanaka's GPR scans on the large screen behind her. A murmur went through the crowd. This was new. She showed them images from the dig, the hybrid palisade, the desperate pottery, the personal artifacts that humanized the victims. The room grew quiet, the audience leaning forward. Then, she revealed the lead casket. The silence in the hall became absolute. Eris detailed the multispectral imaging process, and then she put Eleanor Dare's words on the screen, translated from the elegant script into stark, modern type. She read aloud the account of a sea serpent, of Captain Cutler's cruelty, of the manufactured famine. When she named Lord Ralph Cavendish and displayed the excerpts from his damning letters, a gasp rippled through the audience. She could feel the shock, the disbelief, the dawning horror. She was not just revising history, she was committing a form of academic heresy, accusing a celebrated historical figure of mass murder. When she finished, a heavy silence hung in the air. Dr. Finch was the first to rise. His face was pale, his voice tight with fury. "This is an outrage," he began, his voice trembling. "You have taken a single, uncorroborated document of questionable provenance and used it to slander a great man. It is conjecture. It is historical fantasy." Eris met his gaze, her own expression one of somber resolve. "It is not conjecture, Dr. Finch," she replied, her voice ringing with clarity. "It is testimony. It is the evidence of the victims themselves, supported by the archaeological reality in the ground and the circumstantial evidence in our own archives, which we have failed to properly connect until now. We have been so willing to accept the mystery, to romanticize the idea of a lost colony, that we failed to consider the most mundane and brutal of human motives, greed and political ambition. The colonists weren't lost. They were silenced. Their story was not erased by time or by the wilderness. It was buried by men like Lord Cavendish, and by a state that found the truth too inconvenient to bear. She looked out at the sea of stunned faces. The unveiling was complete. The myth of a lost colony was dead. In its place was a far more terrible and far more human truth. The aftermath of Eris's presentation was a storm in the quiet world of academia. Her findings were fiercely debated, attacked by traditionalists and championed by a new generation of researchers who immediately began to re-examine other colonial-era mysteries through a lens of political intrigue. But the evidence was too compelling to dismiss. The casket, Eleanor Dare's account, the archaeological site, it was a trinity of proof that slowly, inexorably, rewrote the history books. The site on Hatteras Island was declared a historical monument and a memorial, a place of pilgrimage and remembrance. It was not a theme park or a reconstruction, but a quiet, somber place, the ground left undisturbed after the initial excavation, forever a grave and a testament. A simple granite wall was erected, and on it were carved the 117 names from the official manifest, the names from Eleanor Dare's list of the dead. For the first time, their fate was not a question mark but a period. They were not the forgotten. They were the remembered. For Eris Thorne, the discovery was a profound, bittersweet victory. The ghosts she had chased for so long were finally at peace, their story told. She had given them their voice back. Standing before the memorial wall one cool autumn afternoon, she touched the carved name of Virginia Dare, and next to it, her mother Eleanor. She thought of the small leather shoe, the crudely carved bird, the desperate courage of a woman writing a message to the future in a dying world. The hope of the Roanoke colony, had not been to found a new nation, but simply to live. Their tragedy was not that they failed, but that they were never given the chance. The resolution was not a happy one, but it was one of truth. It provided a stark, somber closure to America's oldest mystery, revealing that the greatest dangers in the New World often came from the Old one. The story of Roanoke became a cautionary tale about the nature of power and the way history is curated by the victorious. The wind whispered through the sea oats, carrying the names of the dead out towards the ocean. They were no longer lost. They were home,